This is Joseph Clair, and you're listening to George Fox Talks Theology. Welcome, everyone, to George Fox Talks Theology. Your host, Joseph Clair. We're back. Really special edition today with our guest, Stephen Garber, author of The Fabric of Faithfulness, among other classics, visions of vocation, a seamless life. And it's just great to have you at George Fox. Thank you for being here.
It's a gift to be with you again, Joseph.
Yeah, real gift. And Travis Pickell, brand new faculty member, teacher of ethics here at the university, also a friend of Stephen Garber from ages past, and just here to have a conversation about a theology of vocation. So as the listener knows, our topics here always are the implicit or explicit theology of everything in life, including vocation. And we'll make a foray into character and higher ed as we weave through. But I want to begin with this big cultural phenomenon called the Great Resignation that I know both of you have heard about, which has been hitting colleges and universities even more significantly. It's called the Great Disillusionment, even in higher ed, just this huge shifting that's going on in terms of work and life and people changing, millions of people quitting, leaving jobs, taking other ones. And I just wonder, either of you can jump on this. What does that tell us about vocation and the human heart, this phenomenon of quitting and seeking new employment? In fact, Travis, you're new to George Fox, so maybe you're test case for what has the pandemic done to us? What's been happening in the past 18 months, 2 years that's led to this great reshuffling of work in America? What would you say? I know it's a big question.
Yeah, well, I mean, just to begin with my own experience, it feels like one of the things that I'm thinking about when you say, what does it mean for vocation? It means that vocation is always sort of live and never quite settled, for any of us, and that there's this responsive element, at least for Christians who believe that there's a caller, and that it continues on and can form and shift and change. And, in my own case, I was, I would have considered myself quite happy where I was at. It wasn't a disillusionment exactly. So, the Great Disillusionment, I think, sort of, to me, that's the engine that sort of started things. But then there's all the side effects, which is as people move from one place to another, there's a chain reaction, and then there's, people moving. And you have to be willing to move. You have to be willing to change. So in that sense, you might not be quite settled if you're going to do that. But so there's, the material conditions, I think, are part of what's sort of on my mind there. But that doesn't explain why it started. Why it kicked off.
Yep.
I don't know if you have thoughts about that,
the material
Steve,
conditions there's some basic things. Everyone a lot of people who had the luxury worked from home for a significant chunk of time. Yeah. You start thinking differently about your interaction with your spouse and your kids and your commute. But I think there's heart considerations underneath. I don't know, Stephen, if you've thought about this big shuffling that's going on, at what it says about our views of vocation.
I even had a note this morning from a long friend who asked something kind of like this, Joseph, what I thought about people making changes in their 50s. On the one hand, I would say that vocation is a very deep word for us. It's a very complex word for all of us. And as Travis said, it's a word about responsiveness. It comes from the same, not surprisingly, Latin root we get to the word vocal from. So vocal cords. So someone saying something is the idea. Someone speaking. That's the idea of vocal, and vox and vocation actually comes from that ancient root. So for people of theist convictions about reality, we would say, well, there's somebody saying something. It's a God in heaven speaking to us on earth. But I would say that, vocation for me it's a word which has to address the whole of life for a human being. And So it's from the most personal of my relationships to the most public of my responsibilities. Vocation's about that. And I would say that vocation, I'm one of 4 boys in my family, the second of 4 boys. I thought we were all the same. We had different names, until I got to be 16, 17, thinking, no, he's different than I am really, and I got a little bit taller than he is, or he's smarter at me than I am on these questions, or he can play basketball better than I can, or, all those things. I began to think, we're different from each other, aren't we, actually? But it wasn't until I began to have children myself thinking, these are different children. I know where they came from, sheesh, but they're different from each other. And you realize that from the very get-go, we're different.
Yep.
And I would say vocation is a word that has to understand that, because it's really about, what makes me in the whole history, in the whole of the universe.
Yeah.
It sets me off as from anybody else ever, really. And so the things that we begin to think about and care about and begin to work at when we're 3 and 4 and 5, I would say if you listen attentively, carefully, you begin to see actually that there's a thread that you can follow through to 12-year-olds and 16-year-olds and 23-year-olds and, even to 55 and 65-year-olds. There are things that are true about us. I would say that the longing in our lives, which gets back to your question, I think, is that we want to have some continuity over time with with who I am and what I think I'm about as a person in the world. I think occupation is a related word, but not the same word. Because occupation accounts for particular moments along the way of my life, so that I occupy this set of responsibilities and relationships along the way of my life.
Yeah.
I've not changed me, but I've stepped into a particular place and time with different relationships and responsibilities that I begin to take up and step into. I occupy that along the way as my vocation is deepening and unfolding over time.
Right.
So I think you're right about it. I mean, what's happened in the last 2 years? I think probably part of it is that there is a great, psychic, social, economic, cultural change taking place. It could not be that really.
Yep.
And surprising to all of us. We weren't expecting it, 2 years ago. It was all sort of like it is going on as it has gone on.
Yeah.
And then when you can't leave your house, and you can't go to work and, well, if that's for 3 days, it's one thing. But like when it begins to be not more than 1 week and then 2 weeks, then like, what, for 6 months, now for 18 months? Sheesh. It begins to actually change how we think about ourselves in the world. And I think the vocation question to me, it's 3 questions especially. It's who am I and why am I? And then what am I going to do with my life? And I think that, what's going on right now, in some ways allows people, sometimes they want that, the freedom to think. Sometimes in some ways are forced into the question, because I think that's a lot of what happens in this wounded world. People are actually forced into questions they weren't wanting to have to answer.
Yep.
But I think that vocation has to be a word like that, and that is being played out, and the pushing and shoving is taking place in a way which probably we won't understand until 25 or 50 years from now.
Right. And it does seem like the deep unsettling of this experience, that sense of surprise. No one anticipated March 13th, 2020. I mean, just truly like even the great guardians of the galaxy and the global cosmopolitan economy. No one saw, March, first, second week of March coming. It does allow you to reassess your own heart and what you care about. It's like kind of a hard reset. We've all studied and love, Augustine of Hippo, who's a common thread on this podcast for those who are listening. But the sense that we're actually more than rational creatures, we're affective creatures driven by things that we care about and desire, from the low goods of a cup of coffee to the exalted goods of spouse and friends and even God. And that it's by looking and assessing what you care about, what you love, what you desire, that you get the deepest window into a person's life. So this kind of hard reset that I think has happened has forced us to ask the question, does my occupation or my work or what takes a lot of my time and mental energy, especially in kind of white collar, knowledge driven economy, does that reflect that inner true kind of sense of personhood and personality and what I care about? Or is there a mismatch, and is this the time to reevaluate? Right. And I think often it happens in the 40s or 50s kind of culturally as a midlife reevaluation, but this has been almost like a global midlife crisis kind of feeling. And it's coincided with my 40th and 41st birthday. So perfect timing to be asking these questions.
Well, Joseph, just to jump in there, I mean, one of the things that struck me early on, for those of us who are able to work from home, was this weird disjunction that was both sort of hyper global and tech. We're all, Zoom is sort of
right.
launching in, and
right.
teams are changing. And I know my wife, who's a nurse in a large healthcare system, they made telehealth happen in a matter of weeks,
right.
where for years it had been sort of on the agenda. How do we figure this out? And,
yeah.
But at the same time, my life became hyper local, and I was in my neighborhood, and people were walking, and you saw your neighbors, and I
totally
was looking at my new backyard that had a big empty space that I wanted to cover up with a deck, and so I figured it out and built a deck and got my hands, active, and it's just sort of like changed. It's a hard reset in a lot of ways, but there's the existential sort of space to think about what life is, what's important in life, but then also the sort of material and technological advancement that I think has made a lot of the change possible. And so I think those two things together are just driving I don't know when it'll end. I mean, it's interesting to just watch it happen
for sure. And we'll get to this as we weave through vocation into character and education, but it does seem to highlight the value of college education, liberal arts, humanities, those forms of study, which are at the heart of our search for meaning as human beings, reflecting on these questions like, who am I? Why am I? What am I called to do in this world, both individually and more socially? And yet we've also seen the kind of shriveling and evisceration, or at least, transformation of those fields of study as higher ed has been going through a major change since 2008. And it's not yet clear what the 2020 change is going to mean. So I want to get to that, but just hang here for a minute on vocation. Calling sounds like a pretty high bar for work, right? So I think of Prophet Jeremiah, one of my favorite, books in the Bible, chapter 1, he's called by God to be a prophet, and he feels too young to do it, right? Like that's the kind of thing that comes to mind when I hear vocare or voco, this calling. But when you're talking about pounding out the 17,000 emails I did this morning or whatever, as the middle manager, an academic unit, which I love, by the way. I sometimes I'm having a harder time. Okay, I'm called to do this. I know that in a shadowy kind of background sense of like the trajectory thrust of my life, I hope, is Godward and sort of divinely appointed, but it's hard to know if I was called to like this version of 17,000 emails this morning or not. You have a quote in The Fabric of Faithfulness, which I commend to our audience. The expanded edition came out in 2006, which was the 10th anniversary of the 1996 kind of landmark work on belief and behavior, integrity and coherence and meaning of life. But in the context of education, really college and university life has been very influential for many of us in Christian higher ed. We're now 15 years down the road from the 10th anniversary. So maybe you could write a 25th anniversary preface for us this morning, Stephen. But you say at the end of the preface in the 10-year anniversary edition that whether one's calling is to music or to the marketplace, to the academy or to the pulpit, to the gallery, to the construction site, to the city or to the plains and the mountains, these questions, which you first asked on the pages of the book 10 years ago about meaning, are there for each of us waiting for a response. Do I have a telos that is sufficient to meaningfully orient my praxis over the course of life? Do I have a telos that is sufficient to meaningfully orient my praxis over the course of life? Or in the language of the street, and therefore a little more playful, why do I get up in the morning? Could you help us understand? Those are big words, telos and praxis. Why do I get up in the morning? Maybe sounds a little bit more relatable, but how are you thinking about that question now, 15 years on?
Yeah, it's a good question, Joseph. I've been thinking about it a lot, even the last few days, coming to be with you. I'm going to be with the faculty here at George Fox later today, and I was asked to step into this again, and so this is historical and autobiographical and a little bit geographical, I suppose, too. But my wife and I drove from Virginia to Colorado this summer. And when we drive together, we love to be together like that. It's been a gift to us. But we choose a book to read, or to listen to along the way. And because the way I'm put together, I'm always looking for something about where I am going to be, just how I've chosen to live my life. And if I'm going to Jakarta, I want to be Indonesian. If I'm going to Nairobi, I want it to be African. If I'm going to Timbuktu, I want it to be Timbuktu. If I'm going to Colorado, I want it to be about the West somehow. So we found a Pulitzer Prize-winning novel from the 1950s by A.B. Guthrie called The Way West. It's a story of the Oregon Trail, interestingly. And so a group of pilgrims, their wagon trains, we move off from Kansas City and find scout who leads them across the Kansas or the Colorado River and then up into Nebraska territory and across Wyoming and all. What impressed me, and what maybe I think the question of Telos is about, is that they were going somewhere. They were driven to be somewhere they wanted to be. No one had ever been there before. They'd heard about it. They thought it would be, heaven on earth on some level. You could grow anything in Oregon. The promise was, you could look out of the land, and all of a sudden the crops would be there and they'd be flourishing, and happy life for everybody, really. Well, it's an honest story, and I think that was what drew me into it. It's a very well told story about human beings living in the world and travails along the traveling of their life over those months, really. But they did get to Oregon eventually. They had a place they wanted to be, a place they wanted to go. Telos is that word. It's like, where are you going? What is the aim here? What's this about? And for me, the question has been a question I've been asking for a long time, of course, looking at the 20-something years and realizing that when you're 20, you're beginning to make a movement from being a kid to be an adult. The word adolescence is not a long word in the English language. It really came into being in the 20th century. So we don't really have that as an identifier over the centuries, but we understand its meaning today, but you're kind of moving from being 10 to 15 and then 20. And, the study these days is, why is adolescence being so prolonged, in the 21st century? People seem to think, well, we're not quite an adult yet until we get to be 28 or 29 or 30 or something now. But for most of how we use the word, the idea was that, you were forming a sense of identity and purpose and mission in life. I'm going to do this, I'm going to be about this, but I think that, there's, and telos is that word. And so because I've been immersed in the world of higher education for a long time, was intrigued by why it is that some people who came into their 20s, I would say had a deepened, clarified sense of telos, of what's the point of my life? Where am I going with my life? While others, stumbled over that and just had a hard time figuring that question out. Because what I began to realize, Joseph, was that there was a relationship necessarily between telos and praxis. And we never have to use those words because they're kind of highfalutin words, and I not insist upon them. But they're descriptive too, because telos is about what's the point. I know George Fox is not this theological tradition, but it comes, if you think about the Westminster Catechism, the first question is a question of telos. What's man's chief end? What's the end of human beings' life? What's this about, actually? Praxis, of course, is a word that's pretty close to the word practice. It's how do I work this out? So the question is about, when you say that these things matter most of all to you, well, the question, in some ways, that the 20-something years are about is, are you going to form habits of heart that form you into a kind of person that the things you say matter most to you are actually reflected in the way you live your life?
That's it.
Yeah.
How do you think about this as you're a college educator? You've heard what Stephen just said. How do you think about this question of, do you, Travis, or do your students have a telos that's sufficient, to meaningfully orient the praxis of your life or their lives?
Yeah, I was thinking about this as I read through this book again this week and revisited it after 15 years for me. Incidentally, one of the things you say is you didn't interview anybody who hadn't been out for 15 years because they didn't have enough time to have those practices be settled into sort of lifelong trajectory. So it was fun for me to think about where I picked up some along the way and how they related to my sense of telos developing over time. At George Fox, I was thinking about how we're sort of staking a claim on the telos through our core curriculum, through organizing it around Jesus's command to love God with your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and love your neighbor as yourself. And we're sort of saying, well, that's as good of a telos as any that we can
the best
think about.
Best of all,
exactly, and
the big telos.
Yeah, right. And one of the things I've tried to do, and maybe not so successfully, but I want to keep trying to think about it, is, well, can you see or discern somebody's telos through the type of character that they've developed? And You talk in the book about the technocrat, the one who has, who lacks sort of conviction and direction, but has a lot of marketable skills, you say. Mm-hmm. And just sort of thinking about putting that in front of the student and saying, would this be a desirable telos for you? Would this be a desirable praxis for your life? If not, what is it? Like, how do you dive deeper? And I think that that's one of the things I'm picking up from this conversation that I want to help sort of students wrestle with and see in new ways. Mm-hmm.
Yep. Mm-hmm. There's a strong sense that higher education has been overwhelmed by the technocratic or the effective, efficient worker, preparation mentality. Again, nothing against wanting to give students an occupation,
Sure.
vocation and occupation
absolutely.
relate to each other. It's a high bar and a high cost, especially for some to make it through higher education. So how the intellectual work of learning relates to the occupational work of career is important, but it seems like it's almost overshadowed this other moral and spiritual work of who am I? Why am I? What am I going to do in light of that? And without that work, you find yourself adrift. There's a kind of meaninglessness that can haunt, a nihilism, a lostness that can beleaguer you. And I guess back to the great Resignation, Disillusionment, there is this thought that you were sold a bill of goods in terms of what it meant to learn in order to become more skilled and effective and make money. Mm-hmm. And at some point, this is a pretty common story in American lore of lit and film of you find yourself at this hollowed place that the telos gave way, right? At the key point, at the critical point, the thing that was the big aim gave out. If it was a bigger boat, bigger house. I mean, Jesus sort of nailed this in 3 lines in the gospel. He's like the farmer who says to himself, I'm going to build bigger barns to house all the grain, that's coming in. He didn't know he was going to die that night, that his soul would be required of him. It's sort of like, oh, ouch. So I guess my question is, it sounds so simple. I mean, it's easy to rattle off the double commandments of love, like, what's the chief end of a human being? To love God with everything you have, love your neighbor as yourself. There's 3 loves in there. That's kind of it. Or the Westminster to enjoy God, glorify him. How does that big telos relate to the little teloi, I guess, of occupation and work? Does it even matter? Are there some jobs that more align for you with that big telos? I guess that's the question that I feel for my students. It's like they hear the big aim, but then they're still back like, yeah, but I kind of have to like get a job or do something to pay back the loans or make my parents happy or whatever. So are there 2 teloses, or like how do you think of that question?
Mm-hmm. It's a good question, and we could talk for hours about it, Joseph. But I think that none of us live all day long with the big telos, running through our hearts. Like, am I answering the biggest
Travis
questions all day long?
Yeah.
With this?
Speak for yourself.
Okay, well, I'll take that as a humble, insight, Travis.
Yeah.
But I do think that human beings, as human beings, want their lives to be about something that matters more than eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow we die.
Yeah.
I mean, I was surprised, Travis spent some years in Charlottesville, and the poet laureate of Charlottesville in Albemarle County is a guy named Dave Matthews, the contemporary singer-songwriter. He owns more land in that county than anybody else, interestingly, born if you're listening to his music. And but he resurrected that, those words from thousands of years ago. It's a song called Trippin' Billies. And he asked the question, so why wouldn't you then just eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow we die? And it's fascinating to me that those are the words of the song, because of all the words that could have been picked out in the Old and New Testaments that would have been remembered about the days of those writers, both Old Testament writers and New Testament writers pick out those words to say, this is being said out loud right now in our time and place. So there's something deep in us as human beings, looking out at the landscape of our lives, at the, our place in the universe, and concluding, well, I don't know, maybe there's nothing here that really is worth my life. Why not then just eat, drink, be merry, for tomorrow we die. And I do think that, that what a school like George Fox is about, what is its reason for being? I mean, it isn't for in some honest sense to address that. That centuries-long, millennial-long resignation of despair. Well, I mean, is there something out of this tradition of the Friends, of the Christian tradition, which actually might speak to the deepest things we care about as human beings, things that actually might give coherent sense to who we want to be, who we ought to be in the world? Well, there's no reason to be a George Fox University in my mind. So
that's it. And I hope we're making good on it. I want to turn to universities a minute and ask how we can make good on upholding the double task, really, to give students two teloi to aim for. Something that I think we have to keep in mind is our age is consumed with a kind of vision of happiness, which is circumstantial and pleasure-driven, I would say. I mean, that's that Epicurean Ecclesiastes kind of insight of, if life really is entirely material or mostly about material aims, then it's about a kind of maximization of pleasure and minimization of pain. And that's the best we can do. In fact, what is the more dominant moral philosophy today than utilitarianism or consequentialism? So something like that is not just on the popular Dave Matthews Band level, but it's like what's taught in the elite universities in terms of how you would make moral judgments, maximize pleasure, minimize pain for the greatest number of people. That was the most dominant moral philosophy in the Ivy League, where they're studying. So the question that I think we have to turn to is, if you're aiming for the big telos, if you're living a meaningful life, it's going to be as much or more about what's going on internally to you and who you are as a person, and less about the circumstantial sort of like situations you find yourself in. And there's a moral tradition of Stoicism, which is not Christianity, which is almost like an extreme swing the other way from eat, drink, and be merry. It's like, it's only about what's going on in you. In fact, you can be enslaved and on the rack and be, sort of joyous and happy. And Christianity has always thought that's too extreme and a denial of the importance and goodness of the body and creation in the material world. But Christianity does stake its claim saying it is about circumstances and what you do with your life and having a good job and a home, and all these things are good things. And yet the really essential things are the things that can't be taken from you under any pandemic or any misfortune. It's your soul. It's what's going on inside of you. So I guess the question is, how does the formation of one's inner person or character relate to this pursuit of a meaningful telos in your mind?
Can I just add on to that
please.
too? Because
pile on.
Well, I'm glad you used the word soul there, because often it would be self. And I'm just thinking about the way in which sort of the therapeutic mindset plays into this as well. And so, which is a very dominant kind of framework in our time.
Yeah.
And important in its own way, but I think something different than what you're talking about. And so, it's not about material well-being exactly, but about sort of some sort of existential or emotional well-being. But how does that sort of also play in, or how may we distinguish what Joseph's talking about in terms of character from that?
That's a great add-on.
You guys are so good, and I would love to just have hours talking with you about some of these things. But you've used the word teloi a couple of times, Joseph, and
just to confuse our audience. The plural of telos, I guess. Yeah,
but you understand what the language is, and where the words come from, and how the relation between Hebrew and Greek and Aramaic, how it works out. We're not going to get into that today here, but the word telos, interestingly, actually has Hebrew. When it's transliterated and, it's offered into the Greek language, it goes back to, words which are sort of deep in the Hebrew mind, about what's it mean to be a human being, even the word shalom, there is a etymological connection between the word shalom in the Hebrew language and the word telos or teloi in the Greek. Not because they're the same words, but people are trying to account for what it means to be a whole human being. What does the wholeness of a human being life look like? What does it mean when somebody is right with God and the world, essentially.
Yeah.
And so, so character, is a word about that, of course. And I found it to be helpful to think about the word character in relation to the word characteristically. Because, it doesn't, the word character doesn't stand by itself, obviously, in the way we think about life. But characteristically begins to give us a window into what it's about, because it's talking about how do you think characteristically? How do you respond characteristically? How do you act characteristically? I watched the premiere showing of The Reluctant Convert last night, this new film about C.S. Lewis's own conversion. And I had some friends who were involved in putting it together, and so I wanted to see it its first night. And I would say it's really worth seeing. But lots and lots to say about Lewis's life. But I think in those radio broadcast talks he gave, after in World War II era, asked by the BBC, which was the only media in the world basically at the time. There was nobody competing with the BBC. There was no other radio stations, no TV wasn't invented yet. So it was really like, it was the show in town.
Yeah.
And the BBC said, would you talk about what you believe, C.S. Lewis? Yeah. But it gets to one of the little booklets that's, called Christian Behavior. And he does talk about character in a, I would say, profoundly insightful way. He uses the image of tennis, and he says, if you were a tennis player who once every 40 shots, got the ball over the net, you might say, well, good for you, but it would be less than what you were hoping for, it might be. But somebody who actually typically throws the ball up, the arm and the shoulder move in a certain way, the racket's held in a certain way, the ball connects to the racket and it's just in the right place, goes across the net in a way which takes it just where it's supposed to be on the other side of the net. And Lewis says, well, you see, because eyes and muscles and nerves have been so trained, the ball goes where it's supposed to go most of the time, characteristically.
Yeah.
And he says justice is like that. He says the virtue, he uses the language of virtue, but the virtue of justice. He says you could be somebody who every once in a while does the right thing for somebody else, off and on, last week I did a just thing. But he said that isn't the same thing as a just person. Because a just person characteristically does the right thing, acts justly. Yeah. And to me, that's been very helpful to thinking about all this. And because, of course, it is that place where belief and behavior meet quite profoundly within who we are. Yeah. Since you use the word soul, I'll just, give you a smile here together. But Pixar makes remarkable films. And if you are the fathers of little people, you realize that somehow, how did you guys figure out how to tell about a car that, the 5-year-old boys of the world want to see this film every day of their lives, and it's just about a car that loses its way across the American Southwest, and you want to see it again today. You saw it again yesterday, But you realize that it's really Wendell Berry for 5-year-olds, because it's a story about, about the covenantal cosmos, I would argue, where people and place matter to who we are as human beings, matter for our flourishing. And if we don't understand, the relationship, the meaning of people and place in life, then we miss the point of life, really. We get the telos wrong, to come back to that word. The film Soul, the most recent film of Pixar, if you've not seen it,
it's great.
It's a great film. And in some ways, it's a great conversation to have with you guys here. So what is it about a guy who's always wanted to be a big, jazz musician? Yeah. And I won't ruin the story for people, but it's really a story about, so what does it mean? Who do you really want to be in your life? And I think in some ways that question is offered to him, in life and death and all. And surprisingly, he realizes that, deepest within me, the soul-shaped human being that I am, I really want to do this with my life after all. Yeah.
And that's that. I guess that movie has made me think about character and soul really as those elements of your life that are for their own sake in a way that transcend whatever other consequential goods might come your way, whatever like material well-being or social glory or recognition. Like it's that remainder of the true self that doesn't need the external validation of money or applause or likes on social media. And that at the end of the day is what liberal education from its foundations was about. There's like parts of you as a human being that are just intrinsically worth developing, and learning is a part of character formation in the tradition, because it's got aims that they're big aim, they connect to that big telos, I would say. They're part of the very like fabric of who you are as a creature. It's good to know something about nature. It's good to know something about music. It's good to know. As I've moved into this season, I think of my own kind of great resignation, great disillusionment. That's not a forewarning of a job change for me, but I've been reflecting, and I've been drawn back to things in my life that are like skills or habits or crafts that I let go of in the pursuit of kind of career and the aspiration of like the big occupation of my life. And for me, it's been writing poetry and playing guitar, bluegrass and folk guitar. And I had two experiences that felt as religiously significant as any church service I've been to in a long time. One was going to a guitar camp with my father this summer and just immersing myself for 3 days in the craft of playing fingerstyle acoustic guitar, which my dad in his retirement has returned to. And I had been just too busy, Dad, to go with you. And in that moment of being around beauty and excellence with these pros and these coaches, and being there knowing I'm not on my way toward Nashville and a change, like that's not in the cards for me on this mortal journey, I guarantee you. And yet it's worth pursuing and doing it for the good of friendship with my father, for the beauty it creates in the home. And that's it. Was liberating to know that there was, and I think that soul touches on that sense, the for its own sakeness of life that is part of that essential characteristic way that God has like intended and fashioned us as creatures, if that makes sense.
It makes a lot of sense, actually.
Yeah.
Yeah.
How does the second thing I forgot to mention is being part of a poetry group, but I won't go down that road. Horrible at poetry, not as horrible about the guitar, but both are breathing a lot of life into my soul. How are you thinking about character? I mean, at Fox, George Fox, we make a promise to our students that they won't just be formed intellectually and vocationally or occupationally, but they will be formed in person and character. We have ways of doing that. One of the ways we do it in our core curriculum, this new thing called Cornerstone, is having virtues associated with each of the courses. But how do you think more basically about the nature of character, Travis, as you're a big part of overseeing this now at the university?
Well, I'm glad you brought up shalom. I mean, I was thinking about this question earlier about the settled traits that contribute to shalom, to contribute to flourishing over the long haul. And I was struck in the book and going back over it, Steve, that you made a distinction between character and character traits, where you draw on that distinction. Character traits are great. You know, I was thinking about how they all fit together within our sort of program and our curriculum. Yep. But when you're talking about whether somebody has character, you're talking about a sort of integrity and wholeness and how things fit together. And I think that's, you know, the bigger question that we want to explore and think about sort of on a broader sort of inside and outside the classroom, and thinking about how things like exemplars play into that, how community plays into that. And I'm new here, so I was really thinking this past week about, I need to know the community that the students are a part of better. Like, I need to know what they're doing, who they're hanging out with, how it intersects with sort of religious life on campus or doesn't, or, you know, what are the places that are actually really forming them outside of the classroom, and how do they sort of fit into this whole picture of not just character traits, but having character and developing character. So yeah, it's a big task, but, you know, I think we sort of, it's one that simultaneously is sort of a giant calling, because it's so important, because it's intrinsically important to each of us. But on the other side, it's one that I think, you know, we have to be sort of humble about our role, and just sort of open, and also reminding ourselves of the role of grace and God's action in this, that there are things that will surprise us. I mean, I can tell you, I'm sure, I don't want to put words in your mouth, Steve, but when you met me, I had something of a dilettantish disposition, I think, and it was a matter of maturity. And I was after college, but not much after. But there's no sort of engineering getting beyond that. It's sort of it's the circumstances of life have to show you, and you need the tools when those times come to be able to put it together and hopefully in a way that lasts. So, we could be sowing seeds in college education that flourish and grow 10 years down the line. We don't know. So it's a mystery, really.
It is Wendell Berry's essay on the university, and I think where People For, he's got that line about the irony of academic assessment and this hunt to numerically, sort of like name whether you're being effective in your work as educators. When he's like, the real assessment will be it'll be in the lives that are lived, and it might come out sideways in like one of your students' grandkids when they're 15, down the line, and you'll never know anything about it. But that was the real fruit of the mentorship and relationship and education that you offered to a student. And I guess that, how do we pump up our aspirations for formation in higher education, Steve? This dream of weaving beliefs and behavior together to give people a telos thick enough, and meaningful enough to orient their praxis over the course of their life, especially in the conditions of modern and postmodern life, but also be modest enough about what you can really achieve in a few years and having a few courses, and inspire us, but also make us realists, Steve, about our project here.
In whatever order you want to do that.
As I told you the other day, Joseph, looking at your curricular vision and how you've outlined what you want to be about as a school, I said, I wish I could be your student. So
we'll take you.
So there's an honest response to you there. I have for years been drawn to some of Iris Murdoch's thinking, the moral philosopher at Oxford University. And she has these words which kind of got jumped out of my heart and have never left years ago. At crucial moments of choice, most of the business of choosing is already over. And there's a lot more that can be said about the moral life. And I'm sitting next to an ethicist by training here, and a moral theologian across the table here. And so in some ways, we could talk about this for hours and talk about lots of people who said a lot of things. But I think there's something about what she said there that is profound. Yeah. At crucial moments of choice, most of the business of choosing is already over. And so thinking about what George Fox University is about, it's in some ways, as you said, it's you don't know what this next week's going to bring, and like this year of studies will bring for us, but you are in some ways realizing that we're talking about a longer life here, maybe generations of life actually here, that when you read this, and it's got this consequence, and you don't know really where it's going to go. And I was speaking this last weekend to a gathering of congressional staff and leaders in Washington, D.C., and because I was where I was and, what I was thinking about, I was asked to speak on a question, making peace with proximate justice. And proximate justice, in my mind, is the recognition that we don't get everything, that it will be limited, that with how smart you are, how ambitious you are, how gifted you are, how skillful you are at the whole thing. But at the end of the day, not everything will have happened. Not all the good things you wanted to bring about will have happened, because even with all the good work you were able to do in your life. Now, it's not, for me, again, since we already mentioned Augustine here, it's profoundly Augustinian understanding of life in the world, because it is a recognition of the meta-narrative that shapes who we are and how we live in the world, how we see ourselves in the world. It realizes that it's a story from creation to consummation. It's a story that does stop along the way with these Latin posse pecares and posse non pecares, of his understanding of history. So it's a recognition that, that if you're going to actually stay with something, I was speaking against people with political vocations, but if you're going to stay with a political vocation and not get burned out by it or spun out, I tried that and you can't do it there. If you're going to stick with it, you're going to have to, I argued, make peace with proximate justice. I drew upon, an Oregonian to talk about this a little bit. This was not thinking about you guys, just because his life has shaped my life. And you used the word exemplar, a few minutes ago. But Mark Hatfield, who actually taught here later in his life after he retired from the U.S. Senate, was somebody I put up on the screen to talk about for all of these people. I talked about being in his office, early on in my time in Washington 35 years ago. And I knew his chief of staff, and this was his personal office in the Hart Building, very beautiful corner office in the building there. And I suppose the wall in his personal office might have been, I don't know, maybe 30 yards long or something like that. It was a big office with the whole wall, not by the window, but the whole wall inside was Lincoln, Abraham Lincoln. And part of what I was saying to these people last weekend was, when you read Lincoln's work, you think, so how do you do this, Abraham Lincoln? This was not speech written by a cadre of speechwriters. You actually thought these thoughts. When you read the second inaugural address, you think, so how did you put all this about God and history and providence and right and wrong in the world and, good and evil in history? Here you are, somebody who actually had these thoughts yourself. And we're still reading them and pondering them night by night. When I did last week, when I even just walked into the Lincoln Memorial and just thought, you said this, didn't you? And then realizing that Hatfield saw him as intellectual political mentor. And so I had with me last weekend 2 books by Hatfield, Between a Rock and a Hard Place and Conflict and Conscience. And I just said to these people, can you imagine in the year 2021, anybody you work for, anybody you work alongside who could write a book like this? Somebody who could be, in that language I put to them, as theologically mature as you are professionally competent. So somebody, like Hatfield, who was, a professor here in Oregon, Willamette, a dean, the governor, becomes a senator for years, for decades, really, called Saint Mark by both those who thought the world of him and those who disdained him. Why? Because he took his faith so seriously, and not in a way which Washington, D.C., I would say, is full of people in the political world who either privatize faith or politicize faith, and neither serve God or serve the common good. They're terrible curses upon us, I would say. And Hatfield, in my mind, is such a rare story of somebody who stepped into the political fray of his day. I use this example, and I won't go into this at length here, but of Hatfield being the lone Republican senator in the Vietnam era who said no. And it was sort of like, it was seen as a traitorous moment. How could you be this and do that, really? But I also put up on the screen the picture of Hatfield, but I said, I want you to notice that, 25 years later, Robert McNamara, who was Secretary of Defense in those years, the architect of Vietnam in many ways, was in a 20-hour documentary summed up in about an hour and a half, a 20-hour conversation with a guy, and it's called The Fog of War. And essentially McNamara says, well, we missed it, didn't we? We misread our moment in history. We didn't understand what was going on. We weren't forthright with the American people about what was going on. We knew things we didn't talk about. And 25 years later, we realized, in fact, that Vietnam was not what we said it was in the 1960s and early 70s. Who saw that at the time? Mark Hatfield did. Not because he was wanting to be cantankerous, or to, win a reputation, but simply his own deeply principled political vision, as theologically mature as he was professionally competent, required of him to say, I can't go along with that, actually. I will not say yes to that. So in some ways, I think that, when you think, well, so who is Mark Hatfield again? Well, Iris Murdoch is right. At crucial moments of choice, most of the business of choosing is already over. Why? Because of the habits of heart formed over time, a certain character that, in fact, thinks and acts characteristically. It's like Lewis's tennis image, You can do a just act, but that doesn't mean a just person. And Hatfield was a just man.
Right. In the key moment, the serve on the tennis court went right into the square because of the training. Yeah. How do we create a educational context that forms another Mark Hatfield?
Yeah. I'd like to watch how this program unfolds over time, Joseph and Travis, because I watch a lot of curriculums across the country and see people trying to imagine, or reimagine why we exist as a school. I just think, what you've done, I mean, it hasn't happened yet, I don't think, but I think, as an idea, as a formulation, as a plan, it's very rich, I do think choosing the virtue language that you've chosen, again, I'm interested in words like you are, but virtue comes from the word ver, which is the Latin word for what's it mean to be a human being. Virile, we get to have the word virile.
Yeah, right.
And it's, we think, well, what's virile mean? Well, it means, manly, I suppose, in one sense of the word, but actually the deeper sense is it's human being. What does it mean to be a person in the world?
Yeah.
So virtues point us to our own truest humanity. That's what they do. So for you to think conceptually, curricularly about, who you want your students to be, because in some ways your own theological anthropology is informed by what it is informed by. You think, well, these are the things that matter most to people and to the polity, to the larger life together. Yeah. And so that we want our students we're going to talk this language. We're going to create readings that, shape us to think about these ideas. We're going to, the testing somehow is going to be some way an assessment of, not only, do you grasp the idea, but, given what I know about you guys, it's going to be, but who are you becoming now as you read these people, as you think about these things?
Yeah.
This isn't new to you because you have read what I've written, but I'm quite a student of Walker Percy's too, and I've never been able to get away from that damning, argument that we can get all A's and still flunk life. So how do you avoid here, intellectually mastering the cornerstone curriculum,
right.
but actually forming people who are who you want them to be.
Right. Being clever, but being vicious. I mean, even Aristotle saw this in a pre-Christian pagan sense. I want to bring it in for a landing on this question of calling as it relates to our ability to enter into and the suffering of others in love. So if you boiled like the whole vision, we have these 12 virtues, 12 courses, the big telos of the double commandment of love for God, love for others, love for yourself in a healthy way. At the end of the day, the proof would be in the pudding of this curriculum, and that is, as 1 John says, how can you love this invisible God if you don't love concretely the brother, the sister who's right in front of you? And you say, actually, in your preface to the newer edition, that a question that's become core to your own calling, Steve, is why is it in the face of situations that seem too complex, too broken, that human beings sometimes still choose to enter in, knowing that they will suffer, knowing that it will cost them, that for love's sake, they still choose responsibility. How are you thinking about that question now, and how do we form a generation that wants to choose to enter in?
It's a weighty question for me, and so these things I've written about, in this book and other books, they never have ever been sort of intellectually interesting to me on that sort of simple sense. They've always been existentially born questions of thinking things which bother me, that weigh upon me, that I get up in the morning thinking about, that I go to bed at night thinking about. So that question is really a question of my life for the years of my life. I wrote a book after this one called Visions of Vocation, which has as its question, how can you know the world and still love the world? Because I think that's the hardest of all the questions, actually. How do you have the eyes of your heart open to what's really going on in the world and still choose to care about it? Because, mostly we think, well, okay, I'm not going to. That would cost me too much. I will not do that. I used to be, when I was 20 and full of idealism, maybe, but I'm 30 now. I'm 45 now. Right. You can't do that, and I'm not going to get hurt again by thinking things like that. Or you might, in the world of, because it's not just Washington, D.C., but it's in some ways it's full of that as a city, but it's a place where people learn to play the game, and they think, well, okay, I came here with political visions and ideals and hopes, but, I'm not naive anymore. I'm going to get mine because everybody else is getting theirs. And so how do you explain somebody who actually, chooses differently, chooses to enter in, to step in, and knowing that it will cost them? I was had a Zoom conversation last Friday morning with a guy who's a financier in London. He's a very seriously Jewish man, wears a little, cap on his head, and but he oversees like investments in hundreds of millions and even to billions of dollars. He talked to me about wanting to move the marketplace in England, not just his own work, but from what he called contract to covenant. And that was intriguing to me. And he was reading actually the Visions of Vocation book last week. And he said, can I talk to you about this? And he said, part of for me, because there's a whole chapter in it on the Hebrew way of knowing. And I was arguing in the chapter about, that the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, mysterious as has always been to me in my life. Why, oh Lord, did you name it that? Why couldn't it have been something more simply understood? But he said, I think what you've done, he's somebody who actually every day immerses himself in the Torah. And I was listening to him, I was thinking, do I know Christians like this? Who are so serious about their own texts, biblical texts, as he would see himself as an Orthodox Jew, who just immerses himself in serious reflection on what the Torah teaches, and sees it actually calling him as a man with, many, many employees and much resource to watch over, to move the conversation from simply contractual to covenantal.
How would you draw like a real clear, quick distinction of a contractual versus a covenantal?
Well, contractual is like you basically say, well, I want this done. You do this, I'll pay you this, and then we'll talk about if you did it or not, and and we're done.
Right.
Covenantal actually says that I assume there's a relationship between us.
Yeah.
And that therefore, because there is, I'm responsible to you. I'm responsible for you. So a marriage, maybe there are certain contractual, but in some ways that puts it too simplistically and painfully, hollow, I would say. I mean, the truest and best marriages are covenantal. Right. Because they assume the necessary nexus of relationship and responsibility, a responsibility born of love. So for me, the idea of entering into a world is broken and wounded, and messy as it always is all day long, you do so in some ways in imitation of Christ fundamentally. Yeah. Because that's what he did, and that we are called to be that in the world. Yeah. If I think back a little bit about the history, what I know a tiny little bit of the Quaker, the Society of Friends, I mean, it was this, in some ways, a pushing back, a longing for something more than what the established religion of its own day, Anglican England was in the 1600s, and George Fox and others were saying, we want more than that, really. We want something more lively, more important, more that goes, that's, has consequence for how we treat people in the world. So I think in some ways there's a heritage that you draw upon here that is clearly that, at its very best, of course, of, Quakers, the more pantheistic Quakers of New England, and the more, other than that here in Newburgh, Oregon, and Malone, Ohio, there is a sense of, that wherever the Quakers have gone, though, there is a sense of neighborliness, of a sense of responsibility to our neighbor, to the world around us. So in some ways, I think that maybe is as deep a part of the tradition which brings you into being as anything, But in some ways, it was interesting to me to have this Orthodox Jew last week, who's this, financier for far beyond my world, just say, I think what you've done with this Genesis 1, 2, and 3 is right, Steve. He says that's intriguing to me just to see how you've dug into this like this, and because I'm not a Hebrew scholar for a moment, really, but I was wrestling myself with how do you account for seeing the world and still caring about the world.
That's it. Oh man, it's a beautiful image to finish on. I think as soon as a covenantal view of the world is what we're hungering for, and a marriage is a great example, because as soon as you're talking about the financial and legal implications of the contract of marriage, you're in a tough spot, right? I think
you're already done.
The threads have shown themselves. Yeah. Whereas assuming relationship and the responsibilities born of love as the nature of human community, not just in marriage, is the vision. And yet it's really hard to want to be assuming relationship when you've been burned, or when you see how self-interested and vicious the machine actually is in finance or in government or in politics or in technology and social media. I mean, just this is this disillusioning element of human nature that Augustine, that the Bible really has, but Augustine kind of sharpens. And I think the question for me that you've left us with is, how do you be people who see but still enter in, still follow the Philippians 2 way of Christ, who descends in, fully engages in the incarnation, knowing what he's getting into.
Yeah.
And in choosing to build a kind of covenantal bond in the face of brokenness and complexity and hurt, where there's forgiveness and forgiving that must go on, because it's that covenantal form of friendship that I actually think is, it's the deep calling. It's also a taste of the eternal life that I think we're hungering for. You know, I mean, that's Augustine's other insight, is that the big telos of the double commandment of love for God and neighbor and self is actually a call to a kind of friendship that you're hungering for, and that's what eternity is going to be characterized by. So thank you. How do we form a generation of students who are theologically mature enough to understand that, to see, but to enter in, and also to be professionally competent so they can make a difference as they enter in to the fabric? It's a lot to think about. Really grateful for your time today, Stephen, for being here. Yeah. Travis, for joining us. Yeah. What a great conversation.
Enjoyed it.
Thank you. This has been a production of George Fox Digital. If you like what you're hearing, subscribe to the George Fox Talks podcast on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you stream things on your phone or computer. Check us out on the web at georgefox.edu/talks, where we have videos, publications, and more. And we're also on YouTube at youtube.com/GeorgeFoxTalks.